He took the microphone from my daughter's graduation coordinator, like he'd earned the right to it. 200 people watched him smile. That easy practice smile I used to love. Then he said the words that would end our marriage in front of everyone I knew. I sat frozen in my dress uniform, 18 years of my life collapsing into 11 seconds of silence, and then before I could even breathe, my daughter stood up. "Dad," she said, "there's something you should know. I want to tell you how we got here, because none of this makes sense without the beginning." I was 30 years old when I found out I couldn't have children. 2 years of trying, 2 years of appointments and needles and calendars, marked in red ink, and then a doctor with kind eyes telling me the word unlikely, in a way that meant never. I remember sitting in the parking lot of that clinic in my car, still in uniform and not crying. I'd learned a long time ago how to hold things. That's what 14 years in the army teaches you, if nothing else. How to carry weight without letting your face show it. Daniel took it hard, too. Or at least that's what I believed at the time. We talked about adoption. We talked about waiting. Mostly, we just stopped talking about it at all the way people do, when a wound gets too familiar to keep touching. I was deployed more than I was home in those years. That's the truth. Nobody puts on a recruiting poster. The missed birthdays. The phone calls cut short by static and time zones. The ache of loving someone from 4,000 miles away. Daniel handled the distance worse than I expected. I told myself it was loneliness. I didn't yet understand what loneliness could turn into. Then one evening, I came home from a 9-month rotation and found him standing in the living room holding a baby. I remember the smell of the house first. Something unfamiliar, formula and baby powder wrong, in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind caught up. Daniel's face was gray. He didn't even say hello. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. The baby was his. A woman named Renee. Someone from his office. Someone I'd shaken hands with once at a Christmas party and thought nothing of. She hadn't wanted the responsibility. That's the word he used, responsibility. Like the baby in his arms. Was a line item instead of a life. He said she'd signed away her rights. He said he didn't know what else to do. He said he was sorry over and over, until the words stopped meaning anything. I could have walked out that night. Looking back, I think most people would have understood if I had. My marriage had been broken in the worst possible way, by the worst possible betrayal, and I owed this stranger's daughter nothing at all. But then I looked at her. She was maybe 8 months old, dark-haired, wide-eyed, entirely unaware that she'd just become the center of a war she had no part in starting. She looked up at me with an expression that had nothing to do with Daniel or Renee, or any of the choices the adults around her had made. She just looked tired and hungry and small. I don't know how to explain what happened in me in that moment, except to say that something that had been broken in the clinic parking lot 2 years earlier suddenly found a way to matter again. I reached out. She wrapped her whole fist around one of my fingers. I named her Emily after my grandmother. I didn't have to. Daniel said I could call her whatever I wanted, since I was the one who was going to be raising her, since he had never been much good at the day-to-day work of loving someone. I remember thinking even then that this was the first honest thing he'd said to me in weeks. That was 18 years ago. Now I was sitting in a folding chair in a high school auditorium, watching that same little girl walk across a stage in a blue cap and gown. And I had never in my life felt prouder of anything. Not my commission, not my medals, not a single one of the achievements that filled the walls of my office. Nothing came close to watching Emily Foster cross that stage as valedictorian. Her voice steady, her chin lifted, thanking her teachers and her friends. And I'll never forget this part, thanking her mother for never once making me feel like I was anyone's mistake. I had to look down at my hands so no one would see me cry. And then the principal invited Daniel up to say a few words, since he'd made a donation toward the new science wing, since appearances had always mattered more to him than substance. I remember thinking foolishly that he might actually rise to the occasion. 18 years is a long time. People change. Fathers find their way back to gratitude even late. He took the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, found my eyes, and smiled that same easy smile. "I just want to say," he said, "thank you to my wife Natalie for raising my mistress's daughter all these years. The auditorium went absolutely silent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. 18 years of birthday parties, and school pickups and fevers in the middle of the night, reduced in front of hundreds of strangers to 5 words that weren't even accurate. Renee had never been his mistress, not legally. Not really, just a mistake he'd made once, and never fully owned. But accuracy wasn't the point. Humiliation was the point. He wanted everyone in that room to know that the woman who had raised his daughter wasn't really her mother at all. I felt my whole body go cold. And then before I could stand, before I could even decide what I was going to do, Emily rose from her seat in the front row, turned to face her father, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent room. "Dad," she said, "there's something you should know." To understand what Emily was about to say, you have to go back to the night. Everything started 18 years before that graduation stage in a house that still smelled like the life I thought I was living. I was 30 years old, freshly home from a deployment that had stretched 2 months past its original date, still adjusting to sleeping in a bed that didn't shift under me. Daniel had picked me up from the base, looking strange, not happy to see me. Not exactly nervous, just off in a way I couldn't name yet. I remember thinking maybe he'd wrecked the car or lost his job. I wasn't prepared for what he actually said. "There's something I need to tell you," he told me, standing in our kitchen with his hands flat on the counter, like he needed it to hold him up. Then he told me about Renee, about the affair, about the baby that had been born 3 weeks earlier, a baby he hadn't mentioned once during any of our calls, a baby he'd apparently known about for the better part of a year. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think people romanticize forgiveness too easily. I did not feel noble. I felt like the floor had opened underneath me. I had just spent 2 years grieving a body that couldn't carry a child. And here was proof that the problem had never been fertility at all. It had been him choosing someone else, while I was overseas doing a job that required me to trust the people I'd left behind. I told him I wanted a divorce. I meant it completely in that moment with my whole chest. And then he brought her in from the other room. Emily was so small, not sleeping awake alert, watching me with the particular seriousness that some babies have, like they're taking attendance of the room. Daniel said Renee didn't want the responsibility of raising her alone, that she'd asked him to take custody. That if I left, he honestly didn't know what would happen to this child. He wasn't a man built for solo parenting. I understood that about him even then. I stood in that kitchen holding my rage in one hand and this stranger's daughter's future in the other. And I made a decision that would define the next 18 years of my life. I picked her up. She didn't cry. She just curled her small fist around my finger and held on the way infants do reflexively without meaning. And yet it felt like meaning anyway. I remember thinking with a clarity that surprised me, she didn't betray me. She's a child. She didn't do anything except get born into a mess she had no say in. That became the sentence I repeated to myself for the next 2 decades on every hard day that followed. I didn't divorce Daniel that year. I told myself I was staying for Emily, and that was true. But if I'm honest, there was something else too. A stubbornness in me that refused to let his mistake be the thing that broke my life apart. I decided I would build something out of the wreckage instead of walking away from it. The years that followed blurred together in the best way, the way good years do. I remember dropping Emily off at preschool in her too big backpack, watching her wave at me through the glass door, like it was the only person in the world worth waving at. I remember the deployments where I missed her recital and her first day of kindergarten. The way I'd call every single night, regardless of time zone, whispering bedtime stories over static-filled lines, while she fell asleep with the phone still pressed to her ear on the other end. I remember sitting up with her through 104 degrees fever when she was 6, sponging her forehead with cool water while Daniel slept undisturbed down the hall. Too tired from work, he said, to be much help. I remember every parent-teacher conference, every science fair board glued together at midnight, every scraped knee and broken heart, and the year she decided she hated math until I found a tutor who made her love it again. I taught her to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings, gripping the door handle while she stalled the car for the 5th time, and laughed until she cried. I taught her how to change a tire, how to read a lease before she signed it, how to tell when someone was lying to her, a skill I'll admit I developed out of necessity. Daniel was present for some of it, birthdays, mostly photos. Always, he liked being photographed as a father more than he liked the daily work of being one. As the years passed, he grew more distant, more entangled in his career, more prone to long nights I never asked too many questions about. I told myself that was simply who he was. Some people give what they have to give and no more. But Emily never once treated our relationship as anything less than real. She called me mom from the time she could speak. Not stepmom, not dad's wife, just mom, plain and unqualified. And every time she said it, something in me that had been broken years earlier, by a doctor, with kind eyes, and a hard word quietly mended itself a little further. I used to think motherhood required a body that could carry a child. Emily taught me otherwise. One ordinary Tuesday at a time. What I didn't fully understand back then was that Daniel had started to see all of this differently, where I saw a family we'd built together out of a terrible beginning. He had begun quietly, and without ever saying so out loud, to see my raising of Emily as something owed to him, a debt I was paying off for a mistake he'd made, rather than a life I had chosen for myself, out of love every single day since that night in the kitchen. That distinction would matter more than I could have guessed, standing in that auditorium 18 years later, watching my daughter rise to defend the truth he'd tried to rewrite. I didn't make a scene in that auditorium. That was never who I was, not even in the moment I had every right to be. When Daniel stepped down from the stage after his little speech, red-faced now that the room's silence had turned uncomfortable, even for him, I simply stood, smoothed my uniform jacket, and said 4 words. "We'll talk at home." Calm level, the voice I used to use giving orders to soldiers, twice the size of most men in that room. Daniel actually looked relieved, like he thought this meant I'd absorb the humiliation the way I'd absorbed so much else over the years. He thought this would be like every other time, a hard conversation, a strained week, then a slow return to normal. He had no idea I'd stopped returning to normal months earlier. Looking back, the signs had been there since spring. I just hadn't let myself read them the way you don't read a letter. "You're afraid we'll change everything." Daniel had started coming home late without explanation. His phone suddenly requiring a passcode, where before he'd left it face up on the kitchen counter for years. He'd changed the password on our joint email account and never gave me the new one. When I brought up retirement planning, or whether we should finally take that trip to Portugal we'd talked about for a decade, he'd changed the subject to something financial and technical numbers instead of dreams, as if he were quietly excusing himself from a future he no longer intended to share. I am by training and temperament an observer. 14 years of active duty teaches you to notice what people are trying not to show you. So once I let myself actually look, I saw everything. I saw that Daniel wasn't simply distracted. He was preparing for something. It took some quiet, careful work. Nothing dramatic, nothing I'm proud of exactly. Just paying attention to mail that arrived and disappeared quickly to a financial advisor's business card, left carelessly in his coat pocket to a late-night phone call. I overheard fragments of through a bathroom door. Piece by piece, I understood. Daniel was planning to leave. Worse, he'd reconnected with Renee. Not romantically, or not only romantically, but strategically. The two of them apparently aligned on some things involving Emily, and I would later learn involving me. The blow that actually knocked the wind out of me came almost by accident when I found a folder in his desk drawer I wasn't supposed to see. Inside were photocopies Emily's original birth certificate listing Renee as the biological mother, and Daniel as the father, with a blank space where a second parent's name might have gone. There was no adoption decree, no formal guardianship paperwork. In 18 years, in all our conversations about lawyers and finances and Emily's future, Daniel had never once mentioned that I had no legal standing as her mother at all. I understood immediately what this meant and what he intended to do with it. In a divorce, in a fight over the house, over savings, over the story, the world would be told about who had failed, whom Daniel meant to use this fact as a weapon. Not because it reflected any truth about our life together, but because it would look devastating on paper. Because a judge, a lawyer, an audience of onlookers wouldn't know 18 years of fevers and driving lessons and midnight phone calls from deployment. They would only know what the paperwork said. And the paperwork said I was nobody. I sat with that folder in my lap for a long time that evening, in an empty house, feeling something harden in me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. Because here is what Daniel didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn about the woman he married. I am not someone who lets a story get told about me that isn't true. For 18 years, without ever intending it as ammunition, I had kept records not out of suspicion, but out of the discipline the Army had drilled into me since I was 22 years old. Every school enrollment form I'd signed as Emily's guardian, every medical consent form, every pediatrician's visit, every field trip permission slip, every insurance document listing me as her primary caregiver. Emails between Daniel and me discussing her education, her therapy after a hard year in middle school, her college fund, all of it in my handwriting, my signature, my name attached to 18 years of showing up. I had never once imagined I would need this evidence to prove I was Emily's mother. I had simply been a woman who kept careful files because that was who the Army had made me, because chaos had never suited me, not in deployment and not in domestic life either. Now, sitting alone with that folder, Daniel never intended for me to find. I understood that discipline was about to become something else entirely. Not a weapon exactly, I never wanted to hurt him. Not really, not even then, but armor-proof, the truth organized and dated and undeniable, waiting quietly in a filing cabinet for the moment someone tried to say it hadn't happened. Daniel thought he held all the power in what was coming. He had no idea that the woman he was preparing to discard had spent 18 years without ever meaning to preparing for exactly this fight. I didn't want Emily anywhere near what was coming. That was the promise I made myself the night I found that folder. Whatever happened between Daniel and me, I would not let it become her burden to carry. She had spent 18 years as the child caught between two adults' choices. I refused to let her spend her last summer before college as a casualty of a war she hadn't started. So I sat her down at the kitchen table one evening, the same table where I'd checked her homework and celebrated report cards for over a decade, and I chose my words carefully. Whatever happens between your father and me, I told her, you don't have to choose. This isn't yours to fix. It never was. She nodded quiet in a way that should have told me she already knew more than I'd given her credit for. I've since learned that 18-year-olds are far more perceptive than we like to believe, especially about the people who raise them. It turned out Emily had heard a phone call 3 weeks earlier, when Daniel thought he'd made in private late one night, when he assumed she was asleep upstairs. She'd come down for water and paused at the bottom of the stairs when she heard her father's voice, low and unfamiliar, talking to a woman Emily didn't recognize by name, but understood immediately by context. Renee, her biological mother, a woman she'd never met, being discussed like a business partner, rather than a stranger who'd given birth to her and walked away. What stopped Emily on those stairs wasn't the fact of the call itself. It was one sentence delivered so casually it barely registered as cruelty to the man who said it. Natalie was never really her mother, Daniel had said. Emily told me this 3 days later, her voice steady, but her eyes glassy in a way I recognized from every hard moment of her childhood. The fevers, the scraped knees the year in middle school when a friend group turned cruel. This was worse than any of those. This wasn't pain inflicted by circumstance. This was pain inflicted by her own father, in a sentence he hadn't even meant for her to hear, which somehow made it more honest and more devastating. She confronted him directly. I wasn't in the room, but she told me about it afterward, almost word for word, the way people do when a conversation has burned itself permanently into memory. Daniel had tried to explain himself, tried to draw some legal distinction between raising a child and being one's mother, some technicality about biology and paperwork that he seemed to think would soften what he'd said. Emily didn't let him finish. Then, where were you? She asked him when I needed someone. He didn't have an answer. Of course he didn't. There wasn't one that wouldn't indict him. That conversation cracked something open that had been sealed for years. Emily told me haltingly about a memory she'd never shared with me before, a fight she'd half overheard. When she was maybe 7 or 8, Daniel's voice raised, saying something about how maybe it would be simpler if Emily went to live with her birth other instead, since things were complicated the way they were. She hadn't understood it then, not fully. She'd filed it away the way children do with things too large, to process a splinter she carried without knowing its name. I remembered that period differently, of course. I remembered fighting Daniel on exactly that idea, refusing to let him destabilize a child who had already lost one mother's presence in her life before she could even form memories of it. I remembered telling him that uprooting Emily, now sending her to a woman she'd never known, would be a second abandonment dressed up as a solution. I'd won that argument. I'd never told Emily how close it had come to going the other way. Hearing it now at 18, with the context of everything else falling into place around her, Emily finally understood something I don't think she'd ever fully let herself see before. For the woman her father called a burden, an obligation, my mistress's daughter, in front of 200 strangers. That woman was the one who had fought to keep her, who had chosen her actively, repeatedly at every turn, where choosing would have been easier not to make. I watched something shift in my daughter over those few days. She'd always been steady, thoughtful, slower to anger than most teenagers I'd known, but there was a new firmness in her now, a clarity that hadn't been there before. "I'm not letting him rewrite what happened," she told me, and I believed her completely, though I had no idea yet what that would come to mean. I didn't ask her to defend me. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I would never have asked an 18-year-old to fight my battles in front of a crowded auditorium. Whatever Emily decided to do at that graduation, she decided on her own, with a clear head and a heart that had finally connected all the scattered pieces of her own history into a single undeniable truth. She wasn't protecting me because I asked her to. She was protecting the truth, because she'd finally understood exactly what it was. I made an appointment with a family law attorney 3 weeks before Emily's graduation, though I hadn't yet told her why. I didn't walk into that office wanting to destroy Daniel. I want to be honest about that, because revenge stories are easy to tell and harder to live, and what I actually felt sitting in that waiting room wasn't rage. It was clarity. I simply needed to understand precisely and without illusion where I stood. The attorney's name was Diane Whitfield, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on top of graying hair, and a manner that suggested she'd heard every version of my story before, and none of them surprised her anymore. I laid out the folder I'd found, the birth certificate, the absence of any adoption or guardianship decree, 18 years of a life I'd built around a child the law didn't officially recognize as mine. Diane didn't flinch. She'd handled cases like this before. She told me more often than people would guess. She explained the concept of de facto parentage, the legal recognition some states extend to a person who has functioned as a parent in every meaningful way, even without formal adoption. She explained that the mountain of documentation I'd unknowingly assembled over 18 years, school enrollment forms, medical consents, insurance records, tax filings listing Emily as a dependent, every email discussing her education and well-being wasn't just sentimental clutter. It was evidence, substantial, dated, corroborated evidence of exactly the kind courts take seriously. We went through the rest of it methodically. The house still in both our names since we'd bought it together, 12 years earlier. Retirement accounts I'd contributed to steadily throughout my career, including the retirement benefits I had earned through my years of military service, along with the assets and savings that were legally mine, regardless of what Daniel believed about who deserved what. Emily's college fund, which I had funded almost entirely myself, a fact Daniel had never once acknowledged aloud. Diane looked over my file for a long moment, then looked up at me with something like respect. "He clearly wasn't expecting you to be prepared," she said. I almost laughed. Preparation had never been the plan. It had simply been who I was. There was one piece of evidence Diane found particularly useful, one I hadn't even known existed until she requested Daniel's financial records as part of the discovery process weeks later. An email sent to Renee 8 months earlier that Daniel apparently hadn't been careful enough to delete from a shared cloud account tied to an old joint subscription neither of us had bothered to cancel. In it, he'd written something that told me more about how little he understood me than anything he'd said in 18 years of marriage. Natalie will never leave. He'd written she has nowhere else to go. I read that sentence 3 times before I fully absorbed what it revealed. Not malice exactly, something worse. A complete failure to see me at all. He believed I had built my entire identity around him, that 18 years of sacrifice had left me hollowed out and dependent with no separate self capable of walking away. He had no idea that I had a career that had never depended on him, a pension that was entirely my own, a professional reputation built through my own discipline across 3 deployments. He had no idea that the person he thought had nowhere else to go had in fact quietly built an entire life that could stand without him the moment it needed to. Most of all, he had no idea that Emily, the daughter he called a burden in front of strangers, had already chosen without hesitation which parent she stood beside. I made my decision in Dion's office that afternoon. I would not try to punish Daniel beyond what the law and the truth naturally required. I wasn't interested in destroying his career or humiliating him further than his own choices already had. That kind of revenge might have felt satisfying for a week, but it wasn't who I wanted to be for the rest of my life, and it certainly wasn't the example I wanted to leave with Emily as she stepped into adulthood. Instead, I asked Diane to prepare the divorce filing and to make sure my legal standing regarding Emily, now technically an adult, but symbolically vital to me, was documented clearly and permanently in every relevant record. I wanted that the truth on paper finally, the way it had always been true in practice. That same week, without announcement or confrontation, I moved my things out of the bedroom Daniel and I had shared for over a decade and into the guest room down the hall. I didn't slam doors. I didn't leave notes. I simply stopped pretending that anything between us was still intact and let the silence of that decision speak for itself. Daniel noticed, of course. He asked me once, almost gently, if we could talk things through. I told him we could talk, once the paperwork was filed and not before. He looked at me differently after that, not with anger, but with something closer to unease, as though he was beginning to understand for the first time in 18 years. That the woman standing in front of him was no longer someone he could manage with a well-timed apology and a familiar smile. He had spent so long believing I would always absorb whatever he handed me. He was about to learn in front of everyone who mattered to us exactly how wrong he'd been. Let me take you back to that auditorium, because everything I've told you until now has been leading to this single moment. The graduation ceremony had been perfect until then. The kind of afternoon you replay in your mind for years afterward. Sunlight, coming through the high windows of the gymnasium, the smell of fresh flowers from the stage decorations. 200 families packed into folding chairs, proud and restless and ready to celebrate. Emily had just delivered her valedictorian address, and I had cried without shame the way I imagine every parent in that room had cried at some point that afternoon. Then the principal called Daniel up to say a few words, and everything changed in the space of a single sentence. "Thank you for raising my mistress's daughter." The room went silent in that specific way. Large crowds go silent, not peaceful but suspended, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I felt every eye in that auditorium shift toward me. I felt my own face go hot, then cold, then strangely calm, the way it sometimes does in the field, when a situation turns dangerous, and your training simply takes over. I hadn't planned what I would do. I want to be honest about that. I had no speech prepared, no counterattack rehearsed. I was simply sitting there absorbing the fact that 18 years of my life had just been reduced publicly to a punchline about someone else's mistake. And then Emily stood up. She didn't rush. That's what I remember most clearly. The unhurried way. She rose from her seat in the front row, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked toward the small stage where her father still stood holding the microphone. apparently unaware yet of what was about to happen to him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. When she spoke, it was in the same measured, steady tone she'd used, delivering her valedictorian address minutes earlier, the tone of someone who had rehearsed nothing and needed to. "You thanked Mom for raising your mistress's daughter," she said. And the microphone Daniel still held, picked up every word, carried it to the back row, to the balcony, to every parent and teacher and stranger in that room. "But you forgot one thing." She turned then and looked directly at me. I remember the exact expression on her face. Not anger, not performance, just a kind of fierce, unwavering love that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "She didn't raise your mistress's daughter," Emily said. "She raised her daughter." I heard the room shift beneath that sentence, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Parents leaning toward each other, phones quietly rising to record what everyone in that room now understood was happening in real time. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Emily wasn't finished. And something in her posture made it clear that no one was going to interrupt her. "You weren't there when I was sick," she said. "You weren't there when I was afraid. You weren't the one waiting outside my school when I forgot my ride. You weren't the one who taught me what it means to keep a promise." Each sentence landed like a measured blow. Not cruel, just true, which somehow made it worse for the man standing frozen at the center of the stage. I watched Daniel's face change in real time. The practiced ease draining out of it, replaced by something raw and unguarded that I hadn't seen from him in years. Emily let the silence sit for a moment before she delivered the sentence that would end up weeks later quoted back to me by strangers who'd somehow seen the footage online. "So, if you're embarrassed that Mom raised your daughter," she said, "you should be embarrassed that you didn't." Daniel said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. I watched a man who had spent 18 years believing he held all the power in our family realize, in front of everyone whose opinion he'd ever cared about, that he had misjudged everything. Ailey turned away from him then and looked back at me. "And I'm not your mistress's daughter anymore," she said, her voice softening for the first time, something breaking gently open in it. "I'm Mom's daughter." I don't remember standing up. I only remember that, at some point, I was on my feet, and Emily was crossing the small distance between the stage and the front row, and I was holding my daughter the way I'd held her that very first night, 18 years earlier, when she was small enough to fit in one arm, and the whole rest of our story was still unwritten. The auditorium was silent for a few seconds longer. Then someone in the back began clapping, a teacher, I learned later, and the sound spread through the room like something catching fire, until the whole gymnasium was on its feet, applauding not for a valedictorian speech, but for a truth that had finally been spoken out loud by the one person whose voice mattered most. Daniel stood alone on that stage microphone, still in his hand, and for the first time in 18 years, no one in that room was looking at him at all. Daniel found me in the parking lot afterward, while Emily was still surrounded by friends and teachers offering congratulations she deserved, and he no longer had any claim to. He looked smaller out there in the afternoon light, the confidence that had carried him through 200 witnesses, now completely gone. "I made a mistake," he said. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, and when I spoke, my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. "No, Daniel," I said, "you made choices." It was the only thing I said to him that day that could be called a kind of revenge. And even that wasn't meant as cruelty. It was simply the truth delivered without the softening I'd spent 18 years offering him out of habit. A mistake is something that happens to you. A choice is something you make again and again until it becomes who you are. Daniel had chosen distance over presence, self-interest over partnership, and finally standing on that stage. Humiliation over the family he claimed to want to preserve. None of that was a mistake, it was a pattern. And patterns don't deserve the same forgiveness accidents do. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't list his failures. I simply told him that I had spent 18 years building a family, and that he was the one who had torn it down one quiet betrayal at a time, long before that microphone ever reached his hand. The weeks that followed were unremarkable in the way that matters most. The divorce proceeded through the courts the way divorces do, methodically, without theatrics. Diane handled the details with the same steady competence she'd shown from our first meeting. The assets were divided according to the law, and the documentation I'd unknowingly spent 18 years assembling, not everything I might have fought for if I'd wanted to be vindictive, but everything that was rightfully mine, and nothing more. I never asked for anything beyond that. I didn't need to punish Daniel to feel like the truth had finally been told. Daniel lost far more than assets in the months that followed. He lost Emily's trust almost entirely, not through any dramatic rupture, but through her quiet, deliberate distance, fewer calls, shorter visits, a wall that hadn't existed before, and that he had built himself one absence at a time, long before she ever knew to notice it. Renee, it turned out, had no more genuine interest in rebuilding a relationship with either of them than she'd shown 18 years earlier. Whatever Daniel believed reconnecting with her might restore, it didn't materialize into anything lasting. Emily kept calling me Mom. She never wavered on that. Not once. Not even in the private moments when it would have been easiest to let the label slip into something more complicated. I think she understood better than most adults. I know that the word had never been about biology in the first place. I stayed in the army. There was something steadying about returning to the structure of that life, after everything else had shifted so completely. The discipline, the clarity, the sense of purpose that had carried me through every hard year since I was 22 years old. A few months later, Emily left for college, her dorm room packed into the back of my car. Both of us pretending neither of us was fighting back tears the entire drive. Before she walked into that dormitory building, she handed me a small, carefully wrapped gift. Inside was a framed photograph of the two of us taken at her graduation, both of us laughing at something now lost to memory. Underneath it, she'd had a single line engraved into the frame. "You didn't give birth to me. You gave me a life." I stood in that parking lot and cried harder than I had in 18 years. Harder even than the day I first held her. I think about that clinic parking lot often now, the one from all those years ago. The doctor's voice telling me the word unlikely in a tone meant to be gentle. I spent a long time believing that moment had defined the shape of my life, a door closing, a future narrowing. I understand now how wrong I was. That closed door simply made room for a different one to open. One I never could have predicted, holding a child who wasn't mine by blood, but became mine by every choice that mattered. Being a mother, I've learned, was never about giving birth. It was about staying, protecting, sacrificing without keeping score. Loving someone on the hard days as fiercely as the easy ones, choosing a child over and over, long after anyone would have blamed you for walking away. My husband thought he was exposing me that day on that stage. He never realized he was giving his daughter the chance to finally tell the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Blood may create a family, but love, sacrifice, and loyalty are what make one. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you today. Drop a comment below and tell me. We have new stories like this one every single day, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this one. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Let's keep going. My grandfather looked at me from the hospital lobby chair, his hands folded over a small paper bag of medications, and before I could even say hello, he leaned close and whispered 5 words that changed everything. "Don't take me home." I thought I'd misheard him. I hadn't. What came next would unravel a secret my own family had been hiding for months. The message came through at 0640. While I was standing in a supply line checking equipment with my platoon, my phone buzzed against my hip and I almost ignored it. We don't check phones during formation. But something made me glance down. "Your grandfather is being discharged today. Can you pick him up?" It was from my mother, no explanation. No context, just that sitting there on a screen while I stood in the Georgia heat with 40 pounds of gear on my back. I typed back one word, "Dad." She didn't answer for almost 20 minutes. When she finally did, it wasn't an answer at all. He said he's busy. "Can you handle it?" I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. My father lived 11 minutes from the hospital. I was over 3 hours away in the middle of a training rotation. I couldn't just walk off of. But I called him anyway, because something about the silence around this felt wrong before I even knew why. Dad, I'm at Benning. I can't just leave post. Well, somebody needs to get him. He said like I was the one being unreasonable. I've got a thing with work. Linda's got her hair appointment. You know how she gets if she cancels. A hair appointment. My grandfather, 82 years old, recovering from a fall that put him in the hospital for 4 days. And the reason my father couldn't drive 11 minutes was a hair appointment. He wasn't even having, Linda was. I called Daniel next. My younger brother picked up on the second ring, already talking before I could ask. Look, I've got a shift. I can't just bail. They'll write me up. It's Grandpa Daniel. I know, but I really can't right now. I hung up and sat with that for a moment, my thumb hovering over Carol's name. My cousin was the one who usually handled things like this. She brought him groceries, drove him to appointments, sat with him on Sundays. If anyone would go, it was her. She answered on the first ring, which should have told me something. Margaret, I can't drive that far today. I've got the kids, and honestly, hospitals stress me out. Nobody could do it. Not one person in a family of 4 adults living within a 30-minute radius of that hospital could find an hour to bring an old man home. I looked at the mission board pinned outside our company office. I looked at the CEO's door, and then I did something I don't do lightly. I asked to speak with him off the record, explained the situation in the fewest words possible, because that's how you talk to a commander who respects efficiency. He looked at me for a second, then said, "Finish the equipment check, sign off with your platoon sergeant and go. Family comes first when it's real." This sounds real. It took me 4 hours to drive there. I didn't stop except for gas. I kept running numbers in my head, miles, minutes, the last time I'd actually sat across from my grandfather. Instead of talking to him for 6 minutes on the phone during a drive somewhere, it had been longer than I wanted to admit. When I walked into that hospital lobby, I saw him before he saw me. He was sitting near the window in a wheelchair he clearly didn't need anymore. A small paper bag of prescriptions in his lap, his jacket buttoned wrong on one side. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not frail exactly. George Hayes had never been frail a day in his life. Not the man who built half the roads in that county with his own hands, but diminished somehow, like something had been pulled out of him that hadn't gone back in yet. Then he saw me, and his whole face changed. "I knew you'd come," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. I crouched down next to the wheelchair and squeezed his hand. "Of course I came, Grandpa. Let's get you home." He didn't answer that. He just nodded slow and let me help him stand, one arm looped through mine, his grip tighter than I expected for a man his age. I signed the discharge paperwork, thanked the nurse, and walked him out to the truck, matching his pace, which had gotten noticeably slower since the last time I'd seen him walk anywhere. I got him settled in the passenger seat, buckled him in like he was a kid again, and pulled out of the parking lot toward the highway that led back to his house. The house he'd lived in for over 50 years, the house my father grew up in. We were maybe 10 minutes down the road, the radio playing low when I noticed him watching the side mirror, then the rear view. Then he leaned toward me closer than a man usually leans, unless something is wrong, and his voice dropped to barely more than a breath. "Don't take me home." I glanced at him, certain I'd misunderstood. "What?" He looked straight ahead now, jaw tight, hands folded in his lap like he was holding something in. "Take me to a lawyer." I felt my grip shift on the steering wheel. "Grandpa, why?" He turned to me then, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen on him before. Not confusion, not fear, exactly, but the look of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something out loud. "Because if I go home tonight," he said quietly, "I may never get another chance to tell you the truth." I didn't press him. Not right away. Whatever he needed to say, it clearly wasn't something he wanted to say at 65 miles per hour on a highway with his hands shaking in his lap. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I found the nearest exit, pulled into a gas station, and just sat there with him for a minute in the quiet. "Grandpa, talk to me when you're ready." "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, staring out the windshield at nothing in particular, and after a long moment he said, "Not here. Somewhere with a bed. I haven't slept right in 4 days that I could do." I found a small hotel about 15 minutes from a law office I remembered him mentioning years ago. Eleanor Brooks, a name that had come up at holidays, sometimes always in the context of your grandmother's will or the trust papers. It was too late in the day to go there directly past 5 now. So I got him a room-ordered soup from the diner next door, because it was the only thing on the menu that looked like something his stomach could handle, and sat with him while he ate. He was quiet for a long time. Then somewhere between the soup and the second cup of decaf, it started coming out. "Your father came by the house a few weeks back," he said. Before all this, he gestured vaguely at himself at the hospital bracelet still on his wrist. Said I couldn't keep living alone. Said it was time to think about assisted living. I kept my face neutral. "What did you say?" I said I'd think about it. Seemed reasonable enough at the time. "I'm 82, Margaret. I know I'm not going to live in that house forever." He turned the coffee cup slowly on the table, not drinking it. But then he came back a few days later with papers, lots of papers, said I just needed to sign so they could help manage things. Something in my chest went very still. "Did you sign them?" "No," he said it firmly, like the one thing in this whole mess he was certain of. I didn't understand half of what they said. Didn't like that he wanted me to sign before I'd even read it properly. I told him I needed time. He paused. Next day, I fell in the kitchen, hit my head on the counter, woke up in that hospital bed. I didn't say what I was thinking. I didn't say it out loud. Not yet, because it was too early, too speculative. And I've learned in 12 years of service that jumping to conclusions before you have facts gets people hurt sometimes, literally. But the timeline sat in my stomach like a stone. The next morning, I called Eleanor Brooks. Her office could see us at 11. She was older than I expected, sharp-eyed, maybe 70, with the kind of quiet, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades listening to people's worst family moments and learned not to react to any of them on the surface. She greeted my grandfather warmly like an old friend, which apparently he was. "George, it's been a while." She looked at me. "And you must be Margaret. I remember you from your grandmother's service." We sat down across from her desk, and she pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet behind her. "So," she said, opening it, "let's start with what I have on file. You've got a revocable living trust from about 8 years ago. A power of attorney naming Richard as your agent in case of incapacity, and a will that splits the estate between Richard and Daniel with a smaller provision for you, Margaret, and for Carol." She looked up. "That's the last version I have on record." "That sounds right," George said, but Eleanor set down a second, thinner folder. "A colleague of mine at the county recorder's office flagged something for me 2 days ago. A new document was filed recently. It restructures how certain assets are held, including, potentially, the house." My stomach tightened. "Did Grandpa sign them?" "That's what I need to find out." Eleanor slid a photocopy across the desk. "This is the signature page." George reached for it slowly, adjusting his glasses, and stared at the looping signature at the bottom of the page for a long moment. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the office air conditioning. Then he set the paper down, and when he looked up at me, his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with his 4 days in a hospital bed. "That's not my signature." I looked down at the page again, at the name George Hayes, written in ink that was supposed to be his on a document he apparently never saw filed sometime while he was recovering from a fall that had happened. One day after he refused to sign the very same kind of paperwork. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself. Eleanor watched us both carefully, the way I imagined. She'd watched 100 families before us sitting in those same chairs, right before everything they thought they knew about each other started coming apart. Eleanor didn't let the moment sit for long. She'd clearly seen shock before, and she knew the difference between giving someone space to feel it and letting them drown in it. "I want to be careful here," she said, closing the thinner folder, but keeping it close. "A signature that doesn't look right isn't proof of anything on its own. People's handwriting changes. Stress changes it. Age changes it." She looked at George with something like gentleness. "But given what you've just told me and given the timing, I think we need to treat this seriously." "How seriously?" And I asked. "If that signature is forged, we're not talking about a family disagreement anymore." We're talking about fraud, elder financial exploitation, possibly unauthorized use of a power of attorney, if someone acted outside the scope of what your grandfather actually authorized. She said the words plainly without drama, the way you'd read off a checklist. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's what we need to rule in or rule out. George sat very still through all of it, his hands folded in his lap, staring at a spot on Eleanor's desk like it might give him an answer neither of us could. I don't want to think it was Richard, he said quietly. He's my son. I know, Eleanor said, and we're not accusing anyone yet. We're gathering facts. That's all this is right now. I asked her what came next, and she laid it out. Pull the full notary record for the new filing request bank and property records cross-reference the timeline with the hospital admission. It would take a few days. In the meantime, she suggested George stay somewhere quiet, somewhere he could rest without pressure, and that I not say anything to the family about where he was. Not because you're hiding something wrong, she clarified, seeing the look on my face. Because if there is something wrong, the people involved need to not know we're looking yet. I drove back to base that afternoon once George was settled, my mind running through the conversation on a loop the whole way. When my rotation wrapped 2 days later, I went home to my parents' house, the one I'd grown up in, 20 minutes from George's. My father was waiting on the porch before I'd even turned off the engine. That told me something too. He didn't wait on porches for anyone. Where's your grandfather? He didn't say hello, didn't ask how the drive was. He's safe, I said, getting out of the truck. Safe where Margaret he needs to be home. He needs his routine, his doctor's nearby. He's safe, Dad. That's all I'm going to say right now. Something flickered across his face. Not sadness, not concerned, something closer to alarm. What did he tell you? I watched him carefully. Why does it matter what he told me? Because he's confused, Margaret. He fell and hit his head. Old men say things after a fall like that. You can't take everything he says as gospel. I hadn't told him anything about signatures, forged documents, or lawyers. I hadn't told him a single specific detail. And yet, here was my father, unprompted, already building a case for why his own father's memory couldn't be trusted. I never said he told me anything specific. I said slowly. My father's jaw tightened, and for just a second, less than a second, really. Something crossed his face that I can only describe as fear. Then it was gone, replaced by frustration, the kind he'd always used to end conversations he didn't like. You're putting ideas in his head. You show up once every few months, and suddenly you know what's best for this family. I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. I just looked at him the same way Eleanor had looked at both of us across her desk. Steady, quiet, gathering information instead of giving it away. 3 days later, Eleanor called. I drove out to her office that evening. I pulled the notarization records, she said, sliding a page across the desk. The new document was notarized on the 14th, filed with the county on the 16th. Okay, I said. What's on it? Richard is named as financial manager with expanded authority. Several assets, including funds previously held solely by your grandfather, were restructured into a newly formed LLC. She paused. And the house, George's house, it's listed as a related asset within that same structure. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and heavy, but Grandpa says he never agreed to any of this. He didn't, Eleanor said. I believe him, and I think you do too. She leaned back, slightly, studying me the way she had that first day, like she was deciding how much weight I could carry. Margaret, she said finally, I don't think your grandfather asked you to pick him up, because he was afraid to be alone. She pushed the folder toward me, its edges lined up perfectly straight, like everything else about her. I think he asked you because he knew you were the only person in this family he could still trust. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because of anything dramatic, no confrontations, no shouting matches, nothing that would make for an easy story. Just the quiet, grinding work of trying to understand a family I thought I already knew. I started with Daniel, not because I suspected him of anything, but because he was the one person in the family who'd never learned to hide what he was feeling. I called him under the pretense of catching up, and it didn't take long before he mentioned almost in passing that he'd taken out a loan a few months back that hadn't gone the way he planned. It's fine, he said quickly. The way people say things when they're not fine. Dad's helping me sort it out. Helping how? I don't know, Margaret, just helping like he always does. A pause. Why does it matter? It mattered because 2 days earlier, Eleanor had shown me an email pulled from a shared family cloud account. George still had access to one Richard apparently forgot, still synced to his father's old laptop. The email was from Richard to Carol sent 4 months ago. 2 lines, nothing else. Once Dad moves, we can finally settle the property issue. Don't mention anything to him yet. Let's wait until the assisted living conversation is further along. Settle the property issue, not make sure Dad's comfortable, not figure out his care, the property issue. I thought about every time over the past year my father had brought up assisted living, always with the same tone, always framed as concern. I thought about Carol, who visited George every week with groceries and warm conversation, and who had also, according to the notary logs Eleanor pulled, been present at the office where the disputed document was filed, present, but not as a witness, as the one who dropped it off. Everyone kept saying the same thing in different words. We're just trying to help Grandpa. But grocery runs don't restructure a man's assets into an LLC. Warm conversation doesn't file paperwork with a signature nobody remembers signing. I went to see my father again alone this time. No audience, no porch theatrics. I found him in his garage going through old tools like he always did when he needed something to do with his hands. Did Grandpa authorize the new documents? I asked. No preamble. I'd learned by now that giving him room to build a story first only made it harder to get a straight answer later. He didn't look up right away. He turned a wrench over in his hand, set it down, picked up another one. You have no idea what this family has done for you, he said finally. Every opportunity you've had, every. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Long enough that I almost repeated the question. Then he set the second wrench down too, and looked at me for the first time since I'd walked in. He was confused, Richard said. 4 words, quiet ones. But I understood immediately what they were doing, not answering my question, but laying groundwork. If George could be framed as confused, unreliable a man whose memory couldn't be trusted after a fall, then any objection he raised later could be dismissed before it was even heard. It wasn't a defense. It was a strategy. He's not confused, Dad. He remembers exactly what he did and didn't sign. You weren't there, Margaret. You don't get to decide that from 3 hours away. I'm here now. He didn't have anything to say to that. He just looked away back down at his tools like the conversation had ended. Whether he wanted it to or not. I drove back to the hotel that evening, where George was still staying quieter than he liked, but safer than home. I hadn't told him everything yet. Not the email, not the LLC, not the conversation in the garage. I didn't want to hand him more weight than he could carry in one sitting. He'd already lost enough sleep that week. My phone rang just as I pulled into the parking lot. Eleanor, I found something else, she said, and I could hear something different in her voice. Not alarm exactly, but the careful control of someone delivering news they know is going to matter. What? The original deed to your grandfather's house doesn't say what your father thinks it says. I sat there in the truck engine offhand, still on the wheel, waiting for her to explain, but she didn't nod over the phone. Come by the office tomorrow morning, she said. You'll want to see this in person. Eleanor's office smelled like coffee and old paper when I walked in the next morning. The kind of smell that comes from decades of filing cabinets nobody's thrown out. She had 3 folders lined up on her desk, already edges squared, waiting. Sit, she said. This is going to take a minute to explain properly. I sat. She opened the first folder, the county property record for George's house, the one he'd lived in since before my father was born. Your grandfather is still the sole legal owner of that house, she said. Full stop. Whatever your father believes, whatever assumptions have been made in that family about who controls what, the deed has never changed. Richard was never granted ownership. Not partial, not full. So the new document doesn't actually transfer ownership. It couldn't legally, not with a forged or improperly executed signature. What it does is create the appearance of authority. If nobody challenges it, if George doesn't have someone in his corner who knows how to read these things, that appearance can start functioning like reality. People stop asking questions. Decisions get made. Money moves. She tapped the folder. This is why they needed the signature in the first place. Without it, they have nothing. I felt something in me settle slightly. Relief. Maybe that George hadn't already lost the one thing he'd spent his whole working life building. But it didn't last long because Eleanor opened the second folder. Here's where it gets more complicated, she said. I pulled this from a contact I have who does title work. Someone submitted a mortgage application using your grandfather's property as collateral filed 6 weeks ago. I stared at the paper in front of me. George's name, George's address, a loan amount that made my stomach turn, and a signature at the bottom that looked exactly like the one on the estate documents, which was to say nothing like George's actual signature. He didn't apply for a mortgage, I said. It wasn't a question. No, he didn't. Someone used his information. His social security number, his property, quite possibly a signature they'd already practiced, forging on the first document, to attempt to borrow against a house they didn't own and didn't have legal authority over. Eleanor folded her hands. That's not a family disagreement anymore, Margaret. That's identity misuse. That's a crime. I wanted to drive straight to my father's house. I wanted to put the papers on his kitchen table and ask him to explain right there face to face. No more garage tools to hide behind. Every instinct I had, the same instincts that had gotten me through firefights and convoy ambushes, was telling me to move, to confront, to force the truth out into the open before it could hide again. Eleanor must have seen it on my face because she reached across the desk and put her hand flat on the folder, like she was holding it, and me still. Don't accuse anyone until we have the records, she said. I mean that, not because I don't believe you and not because I think your father's innocent. I mean it because the moment you accuse someone without proof, they get to control the story. Right now we control it. Facts first, emotions second. That's how you win something like this. Not by being right, but by being unshakable. It was the kind of thing my old drill sergeant used to say, dressed up in different words. Facts first. I'd built an entire career on that principle. It felt strange and oddly comforting to hear it applied here in a quiet law office to my own family, so we did it her way. Over the next 4 days, we gathered everything methodically. Bank records showing the flow of funds tied to Daniel's loan property, records confirming George's uncontested ownership, notary logs, hospital admission, and discharge times, copies of both the disputed estate document and the mortgage application side by side. And that was where the real crack appeared. The notary record for the estate document listed a signing date and time, a Tuesday afternoon, 3:15. Eleanor cross-referenced it against George's hospital chart, which she'd obtained with his written consent. At 3:15 that Tuesday, George Hayes was lying in a hospital bed, connected to a monitor 12 meters away from the notary's office listed on the form. He could not have been in 2 places at once. He could not have signed anything at that office at that time, because he wasn't there. He was recovering from a fall that had happened coincidentally, or not exactly 1 day after he'd refused to sign similar paperwork at home. I stared at the 2 documents, laid side by side on Eleanor's desk, the hospital timestamp, and the notary date, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that someone hadn't just forged a signature. Someone had lied about where my grandfather was on one of the worst days of his life and used that lie to make a theft look like a signature. Eleanor called the meeting for a Saturday afternoon at her office on neutral ground. She said it needed to happen somewhere formal, somewhere that reminded everyone this wasn't a kitchen table conversation anymore. I picked George up from the hotel that morning. He'd put on a collared shirt, the kind he used to wear to church, and when I asked if he was ready, he just nodded once and said, "Past time." My parents arrived first, Daniel a few minutes after Carol last, sliding into the office, looking like she already knew something was wrong, but wasn't sure what. They took seats around Eleanor's conference table, and I watched my father's face as he registered that this wasn't going to be the conversation he expected. I think he believed he was walking into a meeting where I'd be asked to apologize, where the family would gently explain that I'd overreacted, that George was fine, that it was time to bring him home and put this behind us. He had that look, the confident, slightly impatient look of a man expecting to win. "This is a family matter," he said before Eleanor had even finished sitting down. "I don't understand why we need a lawyer's office for this." "No," Eleanor said, calm and unhurried, opening the first folder. The moment financial documents were falsified, it stopped being just a family matter. The room went very still. She laid the papers out one at a time methodically, the way she'd laid them out for me days earlier. The original deed showing George's sole owner, the new document showing the restructured LLC, the hospital records showing George's location at the exact time he was supposedly signing papers across town, the notary log with its impossible timestamp, the mortgage application with its forged signature. And finally, the email Richard's own words printed out and placed last, like the period at the end of a very long sentence. "Once Dad moves, we can finally settle the property issue." Richard read it. I watched him read it. His jaw worked, but nothing came out. "Dad." Daniel's voice cracked slightly, and he turned in his chair, staring at our father with an expression I'd never seen on my brother before. Not anger exactly, more like the floor had opened under him. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything that wasn't going to happen eventually," Richard said too fast, the words tumbling out before he could organize them into something more defensible. "He can't manage that house alone anymore. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to forge his signature." Daniel's voice rose. Someone had to take out a loan using his name while he was in the hospital. Richard's composure cracked further. He turned toward Carol. "You handled the notary appointment. You were supposed to make sure everything was I did what you told me to do." Carol snapped back her face, flushing. "You said he'd already agreed. You said it was just a formality." "I never said that." "You absolutely said that, Richard." My mother, who had been silent the entire time, hands folded tightly in her lap, finally spoke, and her voice was thick. "I didn't know about any of this. I swear I didn't know." I believed her mostly. She'd always been the kind of person who preferred not to ask too many questions about things that made her uncomfortable, which wasn't the same as innocence, but wasn't the same as guilt either. Through all of it, George sat quietly at the head of the table, watching his son, his granddaughter, his niece, and his daughter-in-law come apart in real time. He hadn't said a word since we'd walked in. When he finally did, the room went silent immediately, like it understood instinctively that this was the voice that mattered most. "I spent my whole life building that house," he said, his voice steady despite everything. Poured the foundation myself one summer back, when I could still lift concrete without my back giving out, raised my son in it, buried my wife from it. He looked around the table slowly, meeting each set of eyes in turn. "I never imagined I'd have to protect it from my own family. Nobody had an answer for that. Not Richard, not Carol, not anyone." Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment before she reached into the last folder on the table, one she hadn't opened yet. "There's one more thing Margaret doesn't know," she said. I looked at her, and something in her tone made my chest tighten. "What?" She pulled out a single document, old and slightly yellowed at the edges, clearly older than anything else on the table. "Your grandfather changed his estate plan 6 months ago," she said, "before any of this happened, before the hospital, before the disputed documents, before any of it." I turned to George. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, not triumph, something quieter than either. "Grandpa," he didn't answer right away. He just reached over and put his hand over mine on the table, the way he used to when I was small and scared of something in the dark. "We'll talk about it Sunday," he said. "Just the two of us. There's something you need to hear, and this isn't the room for it." Sunday came slow. George had asked me to pick him up in the morning. No explanation, just a time and a request that I come alone. I found him waiting on the porch of a house he'd finally been cleared to return to. Eleanor had spent the week working with the district attorney's office on the mortgage fraud and forged signature, and while the legal process would take months to fully resolve, George's ownership had never been in question. The house was his. It always had been. He looked better than he had in weeks. Color back in his face, steadier on his feet. He'd made coffee, which surprised me. I hadn't seen him cook or prepare anything for himself since before the hospital. We sat on the porch, the same porch he used to sit on with my grandmother, 2 mugs between us, and for a while neither of us said anything. That was fine. Some of the best conversations I've had in my life started with a long, comfortable silence first. "You want to know about the estate plan?" he said eventually. "Not a question. Only if you want to tell me." He smiled a little at that. "That's exactly why I'm telling you." He explained it slowly, the way he explained things, when he wanted to make sure I understood not just the what, but the why. 6 months ago, after my grandmother's second cousin passed and left a mess of an estate behind, family fighting over furniture, over money, over who visited more in the final years, George had sat with his own mortality in a way he hadn't before. He went to Eleanor and asked her to help him think it through properly. "I didn't change anything, because I loved you more than your father or your brother," he said. "I want you to hear that clearly. This isn't a story about favorites. Then what is it about?" He turned his mug slowly in his hands the way he used to turn tools over when he was thinking. "For 6 months I watched how everyone talked to me." He said, "Your father called every week. Every single week like clockwork, and every call somewhere in the first 5 minutes, he'd bring up the house. Whether I'd thought more about assisted living, whether I'd looked at listing it, whether I'd talked to anyone about simplifying things." He shook his head slightly. "Carol was kind to me. She really was, but even her visits started turning into conversations about paperwork, about power of attorney, about making things easier down the road. And Daniel needed things, money mostly, and I don't blame him for that. He's had a hard few years, but every conversation eventually got there too." He looked at me, then steady, the same look he'd given me across the truck that first day. "You never asked me for anything, Margaret. Not once in 6 months. You called to ask if I was eating enough. You asked about my knee, about whether the medication was working, about some show you thought I'd like. You never once asked what would happen to this house." I felt my throat tighten, and I didn't trust my voice enough to say anything right away. "Everyone else asked what would happen to the house," he said quietly. "You were the only one who asked if I was eating enough." We sat with that for a while. The legal outcome when it came was almost secondary to that moment, though it mattered. Of course it mattered. The forged documents were voided. The mortgage application was flagged as fraudulent and stopped before any funds were released. Eleanor worked with the DA's office on the broader pattern of exploitation, and whatever consequences followed for Richard and Carol would play out through channels far more formal than a family dinner table. George kept full control of everything that was rightfully his. That part of the story ended the way it should have, but it wasn't the ending that mattered most to me. A few days later, I went to see my father, not to gloat, not to punish him further than the situation already had, just to say something I needed him to hear clearly once. "I didn't take Grandpa away from you," I told him. He didn't look at me. He was sitting at his kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten 1,000 dinners, growing up, looking older than I'd ever seen him look. "You pushed him away," I said, "when you treated his home like it already belonged to you." He didn't have an answer. I hadn't expected one. Weeks later, George and I sat on that same porch again, and the evening cooling around us, the kind of quiet that only exists in a house that finally feels safe. He asked me, almost teasing if I knew why he'd asked me to take him to a lawyer that day instead of home. "Because you knew I wouldn't ask questions until you were ready," I said. He shook his head, smiling. "No, because you were the only person I knew would take me somewhere safe without asking what you'd get in return." I looked out at the house, the roof he'd built himself one summer, the porch steps he'd repaired every few years without ever complaining about it, the whole quiet, solid weight of a life spent building something worth protecting. I realized then that the biggest secret in this whole story was never really about money or property or who owned what. It was about who still showed up when there was nothing to gain from it. I drove 190 miles that day because my grandfather needed a ride. I didn't know I was driving him toward the truth. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you. Drop a comment below and tell me, are you the one in your family who always shows up? No questions asked. We've got so many more stories like this one to share with you. So, make sure you subscribe and never miss a moment like this again. Let's keep this journey going.